Hey there, folks. Okay, this is video 2. So the one thing that I want to just mention as we're having this discussion about death with dignity, before I play the little video, is that how people who have lost a loved one respond to this whole, like, my loved one took their own life. And so if we were in class, we could have like sort of a dynamic conversation about how you think that happens, but since we're not, I'm just going to tell you the research thus far, and again, this is relatively new, is showing that there's not this isn't a risk factor for complicated grief, is that actually people are moving through the grieving process in a very normative way after their loved one uses this elixir and is allowed to die this way. And so I think part of that is because there's a lot of conversation around death. There's a lot of conversation around how they want that to look. People are having a party and enjoying the day with their family, or going for a hike and doing something they always wanted to do, and then making a very planned, like, this is when I'm going to use this elixir. And again, remember that a third of the people who are getting the prescription are actually using it. And the rest of the folks are getting some sort of sense of control on having it, but not actually using it. So there isn't any research at this point that's reflecting that using this Death with Dignity Act in the way that someone dies is causing any complicated grief. There is a little bit of information out there about how when family members disagree with the patient's choice to use the elixir, that there are some challenges, but ultimately not really impacting the grieving process, which is really interesting. So that may change as we have more information from different states and resources. So we'll have to see what that looks like. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. And here we go. Let me put all this down. Okay, here it is. This is just a great little overview.
We really didn't know what to expect, which is why the law was controversial at first.
First we thought everybody would be coming to Oregon. Come one, come all. They'd be taking their trailers and coming. And that didn't happen.
I was probably going to vote against the law originally, with particularly this concern about slippery slope in vulnerable populations and would the safeguards hold.
We saw many patients who felt that they had reached the end of traditional treatment for their disease and that there were no options. We saw, at least in the experience within the health maintenance group where I was working, we saw many more violent suicides among terminally ill patients. I was completely uncommitted. I went into it realizing that there were people who I felt their symptoms could not be relieved, and where this might be an option. I'd reviewed the data from the Netherlands and had looked at their data and was sympathetic with their law and the way they had used it. But I also felt that there were ways in which this law had to be crafted very carefully to avoid abuse.
I'm very tolerant of this concept. Obviously, people who are tolerant about it are more easily able to talk about it, and people who are adamantly opposed. And people who are adamantly opposed believe that everyone who is tolerant towards it supports it. I don't have a dog in that fight necessarily. I strongly believe in people's rights to choose, yes, whatever that choice is.
In some ways, the law becomes a bit of a framework. There are specific things you must discuss, but it means you can have that conversation gives you some guidelines on things you'll want to be sure to cover. And most important, I want to emphasize that it doesn't have to be a reaction of fear or concern or, are we crossing some legal boundary? When the question is brought up, you can have an open discussion of that. And I have a number of stories, maybe if we get into it, about where I think patient communication has been improved, even when it really wasn't what was on the table. It gave a certain set of patients or a certain set of circumstances a clear way to have these conversations, end of life, just all sorts of things about the individual's relation to the doctor and the medical system as a whole.
The difference now is that a patient has yet another option at end of life. And I think it gives patients the freedom of choice and the freedom of exerting their autonomy and having more what I call authentic conversations with their physicians.
The fact that the law exists here makes it easier for us to have conversations. When they bring up that one, we can talk about all of the others.
So with the law the way it is now, it's very nice to be able to hold those conversations. And it doesn't. I think that's the main value. I think what you end up deciding in the long run isn't as critical as the fact that you can be together.
I think for sure that this law has allowed our culture to talk more comfortably about dying. And discomfort prior to dying in palliative care.
So it's these rich conversations, these profound conversations we have for assurance. And often patients say, well, thank you very much. Now I understand, and I'll let you know if I'm interested. But it's having permission to talk about it, which I think is really revealing and lifts the heart.
It is so much better to be able to have these conversations open.
And it was predicted that thousands would use it every year. We were the only organization who was accurate.
Critics would think that there's going to be a huge rush of people that'll be looking to get a prescription. Can you give any reason why they didn't here in Oregon?
Well, I can't imagine why they would anywhere. Because it just turns out people don't want to die, And the people that do are in a very, very special circumstance that none of us have ever been to.
We didn't think that it would be very many. So it's not like people want to die.
I think I'm less surprised than others because, again, when you work with patients, when you're with folks at the bedside, if you will, in a terminal illness, the human desire for life, that drive is very, very strong.
I think you have the number that you mentioned, over 300 have used the law the way it was written to be used, but many, many more hundreds, if not thousands, of Oregonians have gotten peace of mind because they know that they have the law if they need it. And I think that's just as important as the people who actually ended up using the law.
I feel very strongly that our experience was so positive, and that my mother's death, and I never would have imagined that I would say this, but my mother's death was an incredibly loving, peaceful experience. It brought my family together, for sure, very close, my siblings and I. And it made us feel very close to my mother, that we could do this and support her in this way. And I often say that we were given a gift that day because we got to all be together. And my two siblings who had small children and physicians who lived in other states. And, life is very complicated at that stage of your career and life, and it's very busy. And they were able to be by my mom's side, where they hadn't been able to be during a lot of her illness, which was very hard for them to be so far away. And we were able to all be together and kiss her and hold her and tell her goodbye. And what a treasure that is.
2 patients now, their families claimed that they lived longer for knowing that they would have that control. They would have the strength to take another trip or to go ahead and eat even when their body told them they weren't hungry, because they knew they had that control back and they could now play out a few more things. So I'm convinced it's been a great help.
Our official position is that it doesn't matter whether we think it's right or wrong. We have not asked anyone since then to take a formal vote. None of our board members have, none of our members have. But you do have access to the research that has been done, which indicates that most hospice workers support it.
One of the most important benefits of the law has been the emergence of end-of-life care in other areas. I think what the law did is it drew attention to end-of-life issues, and it brought them out into the open. And I think if you look at the growth in hospice care, if you look at the growth in strong pain management care at the end of life, I think the whole fabric of our end-of-life system in Oregon has improved because of this.
Well, I think many of the problems that were foreseen have not happened. The idea that people would come from outside of Oregon to access the law, the idea that these would be vulnerable and disenfranchised people who would make those choices, that it would be because they could not get good treatment for their pain or their symptoms. Those haven't been true.
I also felt that there were ways in which this law had to be crafted very carefully to avoid abuse. And I think the fact that there has been so little abuse, at least none that has clearly been documented, would indicate that the law has worked. So I was uncommitted at the time the law was founded, and I remain. I remain more positive than negative, but not violently so.
There's an interesting thing that people who use this option, it's an achievement for them. You know, they have to go through a process to get the prescription. It's a long, somewhat arduous process, and they will particularly. It's not surprising when they complain along the way of why this law makes it hard. And I'll say, well, I'm glad, you know, and the purpose wasn't to make it easy. It was just to make it possible.
The legislature has reviewed the statute a couple of times, mostly to, again, make small changes, not to look at rescinding the law. One of the changes they made was they added the definitions of residency, which are still not perfectly clear-cut. So that was added. The pharmacy reporting requirement was added. Some of the timing that the reports needed to get. So there were a few things that got changed, but nothing that was sort of substantive in terms of rescinding the act.
Now, what we're saying is it exists, the slippery slope. And can we prove cause and effect? Of course not. And we can't show cause and effect. That's not what we're claiming.
The law has worked beautifully. All of the scare stories were just that. They were scare stories based on nothing. And none of the terrible things that they predicted, that the opponents predicted, has ever come to pass.
There are people who do not like it still, who would never choose it on their own. Even those who were most vocal on some of these things, I think they're far more tolerant now. I mean, we have the experience. The sky didn't fall.
I feel extremely privileged to be practicing medicine in a jurisdiction where this is available. And, you know, I'm really impressed at how people have changed here during the time that it's been around to whoever. It doesn't mean that everybody here suddenly believes in writing prescriptions, but the openness, everybody appreciates the communication, and everybody participates in that. The conversations I get in with hospice workers who were terrified once how hard this was going to be to cope with before it came in, and now it's just a big relief for all of us.
Oh, I would just encourage Victorians to give this law a chance, to give it overwhelming support, and to just reassure Victorians, especially with your wonderful healthcare system in Australia. This is just a very, very positive addition to your healthcare options for people at the end of life. It's a compassionate measure that will help a lot of people, whether or not they actually use it. Just will help them have peace of mind at the end of their lives that they have control and they have dignity and they have the respect of your state to make their own decisions about their end of life.
Oregon has proven what happens when you make the law and the compassion come together.
Okay. Hold on, I'm gonna stop sharing screen. There we go. All right, well, hopefully you enjoyed that video. Deathwithdignity.org is a great website with like all the up-to-date information and states that have bills that are going to be going before the House and all these different things. So I highly suggest, if you're interested in this topic, to look at that. Okay, so this is the last lecture. I'm going to try to post another lecture on healing rituals in the coming weeks, and hopefully by next week, but I can't promise because I'm going to grade all your papers. It has been such a pleasure to have all of you in class, and best of luck to all of you as you're graduating, and if you're not, I know some of you are graduating during the summer, so keep my number if you need anything. I love to hear stories about what's going on with you all. So take care. Bye-bye.